Alright guys, hello, welcome to another channel episode. Remember, this is a channel where we talk about how you don't need to be a CEO in order to have some impact on the world. And this week we're going to continue our trend of going over Tensorflow certification and the course I'm doing. Now I'm going to be doing this course, as you guys know, from the beginning to the end, and at the very end I'm going to be taking my Tensorflow certification. Now this certification is going to be $100, and I think it's totally worth it if you're trying to, improve your TensorFlow skills and or using it to get a job. Alright, so this week I'm going to go all over the NLP section of the course. I am on week 2 of that, and I'm going to be talking about what I did this week, which was week 1 and week 2 of the TensorFlow course on NLP. Now let me get my iPad and show you what I've done so far. Alright, so here we go. Remember that I've been using Notion in order to track all my notes, and also track and organize my my courses. Well, in this case it's just course, but it's also thinking about what other books I could read and what's the timeline that I'm going through. So I'm going to scroll down all the way to the bottom where I have my logs. I can show you guys that on March 6th I did week 1 of the TensorFlow course 3 on NLP, and on March 12th I did week 2. Alright, now if you scroll up just a little bit, I have here a Kanban board where it shows my progress, and as you can see in the progress section I have the TensorFlow part 1, TensorFlow part 2, and TensorFlow part 3. The part 3 is what I'm on right now, and you can see that I did week 1, which is sentiment in text, and week 2, which is word embeddings. Now, for me, I would describe them differently, but let's get on to my notes. Alright, cool. Here you go. Here are my notes. This is the page within that page that I have favorited, so I can go over it. And here you see my notes for NLP with TensorFlow. Now, the cool part about this is that I can have all my notes on all the courses on one page, and that's why I love Notion so much. But let's get on to what I learned on week 1. Now, week 1, I called it how to tokenize, because we talked all about how to do just an NLP project of getting words, getting just sentences, like 3 sentences, like I love my cat, I love my dog, and tokenizing that and what tokenizing means. So if I open that, we can see that here I have a link to one of the GitHub repos that's actually on Colab that you can run in order to practice. And so we learned how to use a tokenizer from Keras. We also learned how to remove punctuation and capitalization and do the usual things you do before you tokenize. That's like remove stop words, remove tokenization, remove punctuation, and do things like that. Then later you can either go 2 ways. You can do TF-IDF, or you can do word to vec, account to vec, so account vectorizer. And in this case, that's kind of what we did. We got each word and we gave it a token. So I would be 1, love would be 2, and dog would be 3. And if you had other sentences that had the same token, they would just be mapped to that, right? You're creating a map so that every sentence then becomes just numbers. So I love my dog would be 1, 2, 3, right? And I love my dog would be 1, 2, 4, because it would now be a new word, a new token. And this helps us a lot. We also learned on how to then get those text to sequences, which basically is what I just mentioned, making I love my dog to I love my, 1, 2, 3. And we also learned about how to deal with out of vocabulary words and how to use padding to make sure that each sentence, each text to sequence is the same size, which is really useful when you're later on doing some TensorFlow stuff using neural networks. So here's the example with I love my dog, I love my cat, and how you tokenized it. You fit the text, then you can pad if you need to, and then you use test data. And the test data is when you run out of vocabulary, because if you started with I love my dog and then you go to I really love my dog, that word really wasn't tokenized and therefore is not a word that's going to appear. So that will get the out of vocabulary token, which we set as OOV, as you can see over there on the top. Awesome. So yeah, that's basically what we learned on week 1. Very simple. Just this is literally all the code for it. And then padding. Padding is very, very important for later on. So yeah, so getting rid of stop words. Another thing I learned, this is separate from the TensorFlow stuff, I learned how to do a little bit of pipeline for getting things out of JSON and putting them into putting them into lists. So here you can see that I imported from JSON, used data store json.load, and then I created a loop where I would get all the items there and put them into sentences. So that's very useful, and so that's how I saved that code. Cool. So now that was week 1. Honestly, really fun. Not too much stuff I didn't know, but that JSON stuff I really did need a review, so that's cool that we went over it. So now let's talk all about week 2. Now week 2 was a little bit more difficult. It took me a little bit more time. I was dealing with other stuff outside of studying, but really, really fun because we got to use a movie data set, which I love. I love doing NLP on movies, even though it's kind of like the hello world of, NLP. I feel like, I don't know, just I love Netflix. I love the recommendations. I like YouTube. I love the recommendations. And a lot of that is NLP. So here again, I have a link to kind of like the assignment. Have a link to the data set. Then I have some code of how you do a neural network. So you do the sequential from Keras, and then you first do an embedding. Usually we would do a convolutional layer. Right here you would do an embedding, and you would put vocab size, embedding dimensions, input length. And so we had to learn all about that. One of the things we really learned about is how you should always set those as variables so that you can later switch them, and I'll talk more about that later. And then you do a flatten, which is kind of normal to move from the embedding into the dense layers, and that's dense layers are the neural network, and you have dense 6 and then dense 1 because this is a binary classification. We're classifying whether movie reviews are positive or negative. And so yeah, this is all stuff we've seen before. The fit, you put in the padded, and then the training labels, and validation, you put the testing padded and the testing labels. Awesome. And then we learned all about how to deal with the runaway validation loss, which is something that happens in computer vision as well. But in this case, it happens a lot with NLP. And in this data set in particular, we had an accuracy that was increasing, but a validation accuracy that was kind of downward sloping. And in fact, if you look at the loss, it's really bad. The validation loss starts dropping and then all of a sudden goes up. And this is something that, you might want to stop training earlier, but actually a really good thing that you should do before is try to tune your hyperparameters. And again, this is what I was saying, that you wanted to have your parameters, your hyperparameters as variables, because as you can see here, I have the code for the variables that you usually want to switch. These are the hyperparameters that we've learned so far. So vocab size and embedding dimensions, max length, and those things have a huge impact on this. And in fact, in order to fix this, that's all we had to do is change the vocab size and change the embedding dimension. Now, the embedding dimensions basically means is that it gets your words, your tokenized words, and it puts it into a matrix that is of that many dimensions, 16. So more dimensions, the more complex it is, the more information you have, but also the slower it's going to be. And I was really surprised by how slow these models actually run. Just this really simple model you see up here took around 4 minutes to 2 minutes each epoch. Cool, so again, that was the having your variables set. And then we learned a little bit about embeddings. So I'm just going to read this a little bit. So like this week we looked at taking tokenized words and using embeddings to establish meaning from them in a mathematical way. Words were mapped to vectors in higher dimensional space, and the semantics of the words then learned when those words were labeled with similar meaning. So for example, when we're looking at movie reviews, those movies with positive sentiments had dimensionality of their words ending up pointing in a particular way, and those negative sentiments pointed in a different dimension. So what this is basically saying is, if you were to visualize the effect that you would see out of this neural network, is that you mapped words that had a meaning of like fun, exciting, happy, kind of positive words to positive reviews and positive labels and positive movies. And so you ended up with vectors that pointed in that kind of happy, excited, good, positive way. You know, it pointed towards that way. And then if you were to also visualize the negative words will all cluster and point towards a very different direction. Again, this is kind of confusing to think about because it is a higher dimension, but if you were to think about it in 3D space, you would have a sphere, and towards one end of the sphere you had all the positive words, and on the other end of the sphere you'd have all the negative words, and they would all be pointing in completely different directions, with the ones in the middle kind of being confused, kind of being like it could go both ways. And yeah, so that's kind of how we did this. So as you can see, like the final note I wrote was, from this the words in the future sentences could have their directions established, and from this the sentiment is inferred. You can then look at subword tokenization and saw that not only do the meanings of words matter, but also the sequences at which they are found. That's something that we touched on towards the end. We try to use subwords. So subwords would be, you know, words within words, or just like part of words, so like syllables. And if you get the syllables and you kind of mix them up, they as you would expect, they have no meaning. And so we're gonna have to actually look at a way to make sure we don't scramble up those words, because they lose a lot of meaning. A good example is TensorFlow. Like if you screw 10 flow, that's like 3 little words, and the first one is 10, and 10 means a number, but 10 is also makes up TensorFlow, and so TensorFlow is a completely different word than 10, you know. So that's exactly what we're going to deal with, probably in the next week. So yeah, that's all we've done so far. Next week I hope to do week 3 and week 4 of the NLP with TensorFlow, and then after that we have one more course, or 4 more weeks, until we are basically done and we're ready to take the exam. So yeah, thanks for following around. Let me turn this off now. So yeah, thanks for staying and watching the whole video. If you liked the video, leave a thumbs up. That's way I know that I'm making the right decisions shooting these videos. And let me know if you guys are also doing the TensorFlow course, or have taken the certification already and know some pointers that I may not know. I know one thing that they recommend is to study PyCharm and use it before you get on to take the exam, because that's where the exam is taking place, PyCharm. Fortunately, I've already used PyCharm, so I kind of understand how it works. But you know, those little tips and tricks would be so grateful for. So if you guys know any of those, let me know below. And yep, that's it for this video. That's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Peace.